When you left or were assigned out of the position as Vicar General, which I think you had for 17 years.
Just short of 17 years, yes.
You remained delegate for Safe Environment, so it continued to give you obligations for the safety of the children, correct?
Well, I believe I have obligations for the safety of kids because I'm a priest and a citizen.
But as an official, special obligations?
Quite probably, yes.
Anyone ask you at the time you departed as Vicar General, or even to the present in the Archdiocese, to tell them what you know about who is a risk in the Archdiocese, who you know has abused, and who isn't safe to be in ministry?
Yes.
Who?
Archbishop Nienstedt, I believe then Vicar General Pichet. Wait a minute, you said since I left the position. I believe I briefed Archbishop Nienstedt before I left the position. So that's, I should have not responded that way. I did brief him, but before, while I was still Vicar General. After I stopped being Vicar General, I did brief Bishop Pichet. I briefed my successor as delegate for Safe Environment. I briefed Chancellor Kippers.
So when did you when did you brief Nienstedt?
I don't know exactly, sometime in the fall of 2007.
Actually, I think he came on as coadjutor in 2008, didn't he?
He
Oh,
came
was it
on,
07?
yes, he
Okay.
came on around mid-year of 2007 and then succeeded Archbishop Flynn on May 2nd, 2008.
And what did you tell Nienstedt? Did you record that briefing?
No.
It was a verbal meeting between you and he?
Believe it was a verbal meeting involving himself, myself, and Tim Rourke, but I'm uncertain about that.
In his office?
I don't recall where it took place. It was in the Chancery building somewhere.
And what did you tell him about the dangers posed that you knew about?
I believe I gave him a listing overall of the priests who were, and the former priests, who were part of the monitoring program, and used that as a way to describe the pastoral situation.
And you used those listed and being monitored as your template?
I believe that's right.
Did you make any disclosure beyond those being monitored? About what you knew?
I honestly don't remember.
And then you said you briefed Pichet. When did you do that?
I did that sometime after he became Vicar General, perhaps in the fall of 2008, but I'm not certain about that timing.
And did you use the same template you had with Archbishop?
I used the same approach, yes.
Advising him who's on monitoring and why?
Yes.
And did you, and then you also mentioned, did you provide any more information to Pichet than you had Archbishop Nienstedt?
I don't recall that specifically.
How long was that briefing?
I don't recall. Between an hour and 2 hours.
Was it put in writing?
No.
And why not?
Wasn't called for.
And then you briefed Joe Kippers. When was that?
That was sometime in 2013.
And what were the circumstances that precipitated that briefing?
Zach, he was coming into office and I was no longer there to be a repository of information.
So he was coming on as chancellor,
That's
and you
correct.
briefed him on what you knew, and you used the template of those on monitoring.
That's correct.
And did you have a list compiled of those on monitoring that you used and worked from?
I did not.
Just memory.
Well, I had asked Tim Rourke or in the earlier cases, and I think John Selvig, thereafter to tell us who was on his caseload.
So there's no written recording of any of these briefings, at least as far as you're aware.
As far as I'm aware, that's correct.
At some point in time, I had been asking you earlier about Father Kern, but there was a switch done at Our Lady of Grace between Kern and Richard Jeub, J-E-U-B. What do you know about that? Were they switched ministries at Our Lady of Grace? And why?
You know, I know that that happened in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I was a high school student at the time, so I know nothing other than what the written record includes.
Do you recall that in 1987, Jeub was evaluated at the service of Paraclete?
I do.
And did you become aware that he admitted being sexually involved with a dozen women over the past 20 years? All started with counseling?
I don't recall that it was a dozen. I would have, by memory, suggested a smaller but still very substantial number.
Did you become aware that in February 1990 he was sent to St. Luke's, who found serious impulse control problems and lack of boundaries?
I don't recall the diagnosis. I know we received bad news about him.
Did you become aware that in 1990 and 91 the Archdiocese found out about the abuse of 2 minors?
I don't recall that specifically then.
Did you become aware that one settled in 1991?
I'm sure I did at the time. I don't recall it, no.
Did you become aware that there was actually a jury trial where he denied having abused the individual, and they found in Jeub's favor? In other words, they did not believe that he had abused?
Yes. Okay. I don't recall the dates on that, but I do recall that that happened.
Archdiocese paid for his lawyer, didn't they?
The usual practice was that the Archdiocese would loan a priest money to obtain adequate legal counsel if he didn't have funds of his own.
And those loans are often forgiven, aren't they?
Do you know, I don't know that any of them has been forgiven.
Do you know that any have been paid back?
I do recall that there was some payback from several of the men, but I can't. I recall Jerome Kern making some payback. I think Jeub made some payback as well, but I'm uncertain.
In any case, after that trial, did you, because of that outcome, believe that because he had been found to have not abused, that rendered him capable of being placed back in ministry?
With restrictions, short answer, yes. I came to believe that he clearly had an admitted problem with exploiting women, adult women under his care. I did not believe that he had ever committed abuse.
So it was your thinking, at least, that just like it was with Waymeyer, that it was adults and not minors.
The difference was no one had ever accused Waymeyer of children, pardon me.
But in the case of Jeub, you knew they had.
Yes.
But you're still thinking adult.
Right, because the jury had found in his favor, as you pointed out.
You then recommended, and he was permitted to work at St. John the Evangelist in Little Canada in 1997, correct?
That's correct.
And you also recommended at that time not publishing in the Catholic Spirit that assignment.
I don't recall that. It's certainly possible.
And that was because you didn't want more publicity about his placement, correct?
The record may show that. I don't have any recollection about it.
He was let's see. He was appointed parochial vicar 1999 to 2000 at Sacred Heart in Faribault. Do you recall writing that a disclosure concerning that placement isn't necessary, and appointment to St. Rose in Roseville shouldn't be published in the Catholic Spirit?
I don't recall those, but I do recall a meeting at St. Rose of Lima where I went to do disclosure. So that does not seem consistent, but that's reconstructing my memory.
Let's talk about disclosure, because there can be a disclosure. That means some information can be given, and then some information can be withheld. And that means that there could be a disclosure or a speaking of a truth, but if the whole truth isn't known, it becomes a half-truth. Would you agree with that proposition?
I agree that such a thing is possible, yes.
And when you refer to the disclosures being made concerning Job and some of the others, is it fair to say that there has been a practice, that there's never been a full disclosure about the full history known to any of the parishioners, at least that known by the Archdiocese?
I wouldn't have that conclusion, no.
Okay. Has any file of any offending priest accused or determined to have abused children ever been voluntarily turned over to any law enforcement agency?
I believe they have, but I don't know that. That would have happened through the Chancellor's office.
And tell me when is the first time that happened, if you believe it did, and concerning what priest and to what agency?
Right. Again, I do not recall specifically, but when we made calls, I'm thinking of Freddie Montero, for example. I believe our documentation was also turned over.
Well, he had come from Ecuador, so he had only been here a couple of years, so there wasn't much documentation on him, was there?
I did not possess his file, so.
Okay. But let's take Montero out of the conversation. Can you identify any priest accused or determined to have abused whose file in its entirety has ever been turned over to any law enforcement agency to this point in time?
I can't. That, by the way, doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I can't.
Why has there been a practice, as seen in some of these files and many others, to appoint a known offender or an accused offender of children to the position of administrator or parochial vicar, as in this case, instead of pastor? Why so, Father?
So this goes in the context we talked about this morning about our announced practice in the 1990s, where we said in some cases we are going to at least consider restoring to ministry these priests. That was foolish, and I wish we had not done so.
It was a gamble. It was a gamble, wasn't it?
Well, I wouldn't characterize it as such, but I think it was bad practice.
It was a risk,
Uh,
and it was calculated, wasn't it? To be a risk.
Of course, every assignment is a risk. So I think.
Not if there's no evidence of unfitness or a harm to possible harm to kids. There's no risk until a risk becomes known.
Right.
Wouldn't you agree with that?
Right.
So I don't think assigning a priest to a parish in itself is a risk, and I don't think you'd take that position.
Well,
Is that a question?
Would you?
What do you want?
What I do, I'm sorry, I got lost a bit here.
Okay, well, you said there's always a risk, but I'm talking about the risk of future harm.
Right.
Once a priest has offended a child, you know from the data and the history and your own that they're at risk for reoffending. You know that?
I do
Okay.
know that, yes.
So when you make the decision or participate in making the decision to reassign a priest without warning and knowledge to the parishioners, it's a very serious calculated risk.
I was reacting to your term gamble
Okay.
about the practice in the 1990s, which of course since 2002 we've forsworn. Okay. There was a prior question.
I forget what it was now. The parochial vicar, administrator versus pastor designation. There is some indication in files that the designation of administrator and parochial vicar makes it a lot easier if there is a problem that emerges to pull them out and quickly and quietly versus if they're assigned a pastor. Is that unfair
You've already
characterization?
answered my question this morning, Jeff.
I'm asking, is that an unfair characterization?
It is in regard, let me address what I didn't address this morning because you didn't ask this morning about parochial vicar. Parochial vicar means, in other traditions, it might be called assistant pastor, the junior priest. Then that means that the priest, e.g., this matter you read to me about Jube, in apparently 2 places, he was signed under the supervision, the authority, the direction of another pastor. So the assignment of someone as a parochial vicar is specifically an assignment of his not being the boss. Okay, I think I did address this morning the question of the administrator.
All right. There is record that Jube is receiving some extra benefits. Do you have any knowledge of that and why he's getting payments beyond the normal, those provided?
Starting in 2002 or so, Archbishop Flynn directed that we ought to consider Jube as a charter priest. And so, as we did with other of these former priests covered by the charter, there was some attempt to make transitional assistance to him. I can't speak to what's been going on the last 6 years.
Is that transitional assistance more money than they would have received if they were working as a pastor in a parish?
In some cases, it could be. For example, our priests we don't take a vow of poverty. So in some cases, a priest might own a home, recognizing that he'd be moving into retirement sooner than planned. We might recall one case where we made a lump sum payment to help retire the last 20-some or $30,000 of a mortgage so that the fellow would not require, would not have to go on the market and find work that he couldn't possibly
Who was
get.
that?
That was Kraut Kramer.
So, did the other priests know about this, these extra payments to these guys who are offenders? I mean, any protests there, or did they know?
I think the answer is yes and yes. In other words, they did know. We were fairly clear, I believe, with the Presbyteral Council and others that we were assisting these men to leave. At the time the charter was passed, Mr. Anderson, there actually was a lot of concern on the part of priests that they themselves might one day be treated unfairly. And so we were fairly disclosive, I think, about providing transitional assistance. But, yes, some of the priests were angered by that. I'm sure are still to today, although I don't have any specific evidence of it.
In connection with Michael Keating, you became aware that in 2006, a report was made that allegation was made that he had sexually abused a minor.
You've just helped me with something, because you asked me the names of the priests I called the police on. This is one of them. I'd forgotten that. So, yes.
And
Or to be clear, I perhaps asked Andy Eisenzimmer to make the phone call.
did you give to the police or direct that the police receive the priest file maintained at the chancery concerning Keating so they could have the benefit of what was known by the Archdiocese about his history and his admissions?
I don't think so. I
And the
also don't
police-
think there was any file with any admissions or negative history there. This was a case of first impression for us. And I might add, very surprising, and one that I didn't particularly believe, but realized that it was not my role to make any judgment about that. That was the job for the police.
Well, you didn't believe Gil Gustafson abused girls either, did you?
That's correct. Still don't.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple that settlements were made concerning girls.
I do
And
know
he's
that.
now diagnosed as a pedophile and receiving payments, correct?
There's a lot mixed up in there.
Okay.
Which
You're aware that at least 2 girls have reported abuse by
I recall one reporting abuse and another reporting some form of emotional entanglement. Whether it was a sexual involvement or not, I can't recall.
In any case, going back to Keating, you're aware that the girl made a report and then the counselor made a report following that.
I was
were you
not aware of the council. I'm not aware now of the counselor's report. I must have been at the time. I just don't recall it.
Well, in 2006, there's a letter in the file to Archbishop Flynn and you, and where the counselor states she believes Keating to be a danger and not likely a one-time circumstance. You recall that?
I don't recall it. I don't deny it's there. I presume if it's there, it's there. But
There's also a name redacted from the file. It starts with an I. I can write the name of the woman down for you, but I don't see any reason to use it today. Do you see that name?
I do.
Okay. And in the exhibit, it is indicated that another priest of the Archdiocese, Jeff Huard, Huard, spoke with you about this individual, and that Keating had admitted to him that he had had a passionate physical encounter with her. Do you recall that?
I don't recall the passionate physical encounter.
There's information in the file concerning Keating that he also had a serious relationship with a girl, and that was made known to the review board that heard this matter. Do you know anything about that?
Is it
serious
the same
relationship?
name as this?
We don't know that. We just know that it's recorded as having been described as a serious relationship with a girl.
Okay. I recall that, and by the way, Jeff Huard, who's a wonderful priest, is this brother to the mother of the young woman for whose protection I called Chisago County, just to keep the players straight here. He reflected that some people were concerned that Michael Keating had too close a relationship, emotional. I don't recall that there was any allegation of physical connectedness of any sort to a young woman he met in Italy, and the precipitating event was her appearance, I believe at his ordination, when he returned. I spoke with her in Italy, and I do have only this, it probably shows up in the record somewhere, that she told me, and we spoke both in Italian and in English to confirm it, that he had always been with her correcto, which means we would say appropriate.
Okay. Well, you also know that many victims, those who adult priests engage in sexual conduct with, have a traumatic bond to their offender and are often reluctant to report and rarely do contemporaneous to it. You know that?
Yes.
Okay.
Which of course why we involve assessments and so on.
Was that a phone call or an in-person interview you just referred to?
It was a phone call.
Okay. you were aware that the board, when it went before the clergy review board, made the finding that the report was not substantiated, but they did make recommendations for restrictions that you were to enforce. Is that correct?
I have vague memory of that. I don't recall them specifically.
And one of those restrictions was that he was not to be or engage in youth retreats, spiritual counseling, or mentoring of adolescents or young girls. Do you recall
Correct.
that?
Yes.
And he was to be monitored. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And he was it was to be disclosed to the chairperson at St. Thomas in Catholic Studies, where he was working. Do you recall that?
That sounds familiar. I've been able to provide that taxative list to
And
you, but
were any of those things actually done?
yes,
By who?
by myself and/or Tim Rourke. I met with some frequency with Dr. Briel, B-R-I-E-L, who was the chair of the, I don't think he was chair of the department, that's a technical term, I think he was the head of the Catholic Studies program.
Are you aware that October 14th, 2008, there's notation saying that the recommendations on restrictions have not been implemented?
I'm not aware of that. What was the date on that?
2008?
In October. That's
October
after
14th.
that's after I was in the office regularly, so. Nonetheless, I do recall that Archbishop Nienstedt was concerned that he felt that disclosure to Dr. Briel, or he was unaware that disclosure was made to Dr. Briel. And so that's, we were reassuring him on that.
Were you, to Archbishop Nienstedt, downplaying the seriousness of Keating's conduct and trying to protect him from disciplinary action by Archbishop Nienstedt?
I think I was trying to reflect to the Archbishop accurately the seriousness of his conduct, particularly given the discovery by the Chisago County Department that there was no child endangerment.
Is it fair, Father, to say that when police don't charge, you kind of interpret that to mean it didn't happen?
In some cases. Depends on the report from the police.
And oftentimes, are you aware that they don't charge because of statute of limitations?
Yes.
Yeah. So the inference that it didn't happen because they don't charge is a little dangerous to make, isn't it?
It certainly has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
As it pertains to Keating, are you aware of any actual monitoring having been put into place before May 12th of 2010?
I believe yes, but I don't recall when it began.
There's a note that Pichet spoke to Rourke after initial plan meeting and that no monitoring had been put into place. If that is a correct recitation, is that news to you?
Yes.
Rourke, it seems to indicate on our reading of that he gets directives from you and never got a clear directive from you as to monitoring. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Is there a document, or we could look at it?
I'm reading from my notes of May 12, 2010. But first, do you believe that you gave Rourke clear directive about monitoring?
I know I gave Tim clear directive at some point. I can't say about the specific date.
And do you have any idea what year that was?
I don't, I'm sorry.
Was it several years after the review board made their findings and recommendations that you gave that directive?
I doubt that.
There are indications that Don Briel was given some information on May 24th, 2010. Do you have any information that he was informed of Keating's history or anything about him before that?
I don't, but I don't have a specific memory.